What if everything you thought you knew about American history, the giants, the maps, the monsters, the presidents, was a lie? Not just a mistake, but a deliberate con. For money, for power, for the sheer thrill of watching people believe. These are the hoaxes that fooled scientists, swayed elections, ignited panics, and rewrote textbooks. Until they didn't. So buckle in. Because the next 2 hours will unravel 49 of the most insane historical scams in American history. And by the end, you might start wondering, what are we still falling for? 1. The Cardiff Giant. In 1869, a 10-foot-tall petrified man was unearthed on a farm in Cardiff, New York. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, and had a vaguely troubled expression, like a man who'd seen too much. Or maybe nothing at all. Workers digging a well stumbled upon him under 3 feet of soil, and America promptly lost its collective mind. Almost immediately, religious revivalists pointed at the behemoth and shouted proof. Proof that the biblical Nephilim once walked among us. Proof that giants once roamed the earth. Proof, most importantly, that they had been right all along. Scientists, on the other hand, were confused. Some called it a fossilized man. Others called it a statue. But everyone called it profitable. For 50 cents a head, a fortune at the time, the curious could come and gawk at the mystery man. Lines formed. Towns were swarmed. Ministers preached about the fall of the giant race. Newspapers launched into poetic flourishes about ancient floods and mythic beings. Barnum himself tried to buy it. When the owners refused, he made a replica. People paid to see that too. The truth? It had been carved from gypsum and soaked in acids to give it that extra ancient sheen. George Hull, a cigar-chomping atheist and professional grudge holder, orchestrated the hoax after a heated debate with a revivalist preacher. Hull thought religion was a scam and decided to run a better one. He spent over $20,600, a small fortune, to prove that people would believe anything if it confirmed their biases. And he was right. Even after the giant was exposed as a fake, people kept coming. They wanted to believe. They needed to believe. Because sometimes it's easier to cling to a fossilized lie than accept a disappointing truth. But that wasn't the last time a carved stone would rewrite American prehistory. In fact, just a few decades later, people would start finding strange symbols in the forests of Minnesota. Not from the Bible this time, but from the Vikings. 2. The Kensington Runestone, Minnesota, 1898. A Swedish-American farmer named Walam Olum was clearing trees on his land when he hit something hard, a large slab of stone tangled in the roots of a poplar. On its face were runes, Viking runes, carved deep and clean. It told a chilling tale of Norsemen who had traveled far inland in 1362, only to be attacked. 10 men were killed. The survivors etched their account into stone as a final record. According to the slab, the Vikings had made it to Minnesota. That's about 1,000 miles too far west and several centuries too early. But sure, let's run with it. The press exploded. Scandinavian pride surged. Norwegian-American communities paraded the stone like it was a cultural relic from Valhalla itself. Historians split into 2 camps, one skeptical, one starry-eyed. But as usual, the ones with the dreams shouted louder than the ones with the data. Experts in runic language raised red flags almost immediately. The grammar was modern. The characters were suspiciously similar to 19th century textbooks. One scholar described it as a remarkable mix of medieval flair and 1890s Norwegian. Another noted that even if the Vikings had made it that far inland, there's no trace of their passage. No settlements, no tools, no bones. Just one extremely convenient rock. Still, believers clung to it. Why? Because it added spice to American identity. It implied a secret heritage, a mythic migration that could override Columbus, dismiss the English, and put Minnesota on the map. There were even attempts to tie it to a Viking temple beneath the Great Lakes. Spoiler, that didn't exist either. Despite decades of scholarly debunking, The runestone still has its own museum, its own fans, its own mythos. Even as evidence stacks up that Oman and a friend probably chiseled it as a joke or a cultural prank that spiraled out of control, the legend lives on. But if Minnesota had its Vikings, Connecticut would soon have its own proof that Norse explorers had charted the New World, in the form of a very old map with very modern ink. 3. The Vinland Map. In 1965, Yale University unveiled a sensation, a yellowed parchment called the Vinland Map. On it, a faint outline of North America, labeled Vinlanda Insula, an island of wine. The implications were seismic. If true, it meant that Viking explorers had mapped part of North America before Columbus ever hoisted his first mast. It would rewrite the textbook. It would dethrone the Age of Discovery. The map, along with an accompanying medieval manuscript, was hailed as a holy grail for Scandinavian pride and academic prestige. Yale scholars treated it like sacred text. Newspapers called it the smoking gun of pre-Columbian European exploration. For a time, it was the most important map in the world. Then the tests began. Almost immediately, skeptics noticed things that didn't quite line up. The ink didn't penetrate the parchment. It sat on top. The lines had modern characteristics. And worst of all, the ink contained anatassi, a form of titanium dioxide not used in inks until the 20th century. In other words, this ancient parchment had been doodled on with modern materials. Yale doubled down. The map's defenders argued that anatase could form naturally, that the parchment was genuinely medieval, that the cartographer was simply ahead of his time. But the evidence mounted. Radiocarbon dating of the paper suggested a plausible age. But that only confirmed the parchment, not the ink. As it turns out, someone likely took an old blank parchment and drew a fake map on it, sometime before 1957, when it mysteriously surfaced in a Swiss bookshop. That's the kind of chain of custody that makes historians sweat. The Vinland Map is now widely considered a hoax, a beautifully executed, well-aged, and academically embarrassing hoax. But that doesn't stop conspiracy theorists, Viking romanticists, and alternative historians from clinging to it like a relic of a lost truth, because the idea of discovering a secret past, one that slips through the cracks of consensus reality, is more intoxicating than wine. And the thirst for rewriting history wouldn't stop there. Next, a miner would dig up a skull in California that would seem to prove humans had been here millions of years earlier, before science remembered to check the basement. Or the Calaveras skull. In 1866, a miner in Calaveras County, California, was digging deep beneath layers of volcanic rock when he claimed to have unearthed something bizarre, a human skull. Not just any skull, but one buried in a geological layer that supposedly dated back to the Pliocene era, over 2 million years ago. If true, it would have meant that humans, or something very much like us, had been walking around California when mastodons were still trendy. The skull made its way to Josiah Whitney, the state geologist of California and a prominent scientist of his time. Whitney was already predisposed to the idea that humanity had a deeper American past than most believed. When he saw the skull, he didn't blink. He published it, with confidence. To him, it was ironclad proof that humans had existed in North America far earlier than science had dared suggest. But something felt off. The skull looked suspiciously well preserved for a specimen supposedly marinated under ancient lava for eons. It had no mineralization, no deformities, no telltale signs of deep time. Still, Whitney stood by it. His credibility and legacy was now staked to the find. Then quietly, the miners who had originally found it began to talk. Some admitted, off the record, that it had been a prank, a joke aimed at the pompous scientists who had come through their territory preaching science and scoffing at local folklore. Someone had dropped a modern skull into a mine shaft, let the dirt do its thing, and waited for nature to take the fall. Whitney, of course, refused to accept the confession. He accused critics of bias, of defending a narrow worldview. But as more geologists examined the site, and more careful studies were done, the verdict became clear. The Calaveras skull was almost certainly a planted object, a hoax wrapped in a geological riddle. Even after being debunked, the skull was paraded for years. It appeared in museum cases and textbooks, like a ghost of scientific enthusiasm past. The Smithsonian eventually weighed in with a polite but firm dismissal. Still, some fringe thinkers insist it was real, because nothing fuels the myth of suppressed truth quite like a dusty bone and an embarrassed institution. And the urge to rewrite the ancient history of America didn't stop there. Just a few years later, a set of inscribed stones surfaced in Ohio, claiming to link Native Americans to ancient Hebrews. It was predictably a revelation no one asked for, and everyone argued about. 5. The Newark Holy Stones. In 1860, David Wyrick, a surveyor and amateur archaeologist in Ohio, was digging near ancient Native American mounds when he stumbled upon something unexpected: a small stone carved with Hebrew characters. Not just random scratches, full-on inscriptions. The kind that, if taken seriously, suggested that ancient Jewish people had made it all the way to the American Midwest. Then he found another, and another. The most elaborate was a keystone-shaped relic with a central passage reading, "Holy of Holies," a phrase straight out of the Hebrew Bible. The crown jewel was the Decalogue stone, featuring a carving of Moses himself, holding the Ten Commandments in Paleo-Hebrew. It was too much, too specific, too convenient. To believers, it was divine confirmation. Proof that the lost tribes of Israel had crossed oceans, built monuments, and left scripture beneath the American soil. For a young nation obsessed with biblical validation, this was cultural catnip. The stones were paraded around churches, displayed in fairs, and used as ammunition in the great 19th century battle over who really discovered America. But skeptics smelled chisel dust. The style of the Hebrew was oddly modern. The carving techniques matched 19th century tools. And most damning of all, David Wyrick himself had recently purchased a book on ancient alphabets, including, you guessed it, Hebrew. Defenders insisted he had simply been divinely guided, that God had placed the stones in his path, that this wasn't forgery, it was fate. But scholars weren't buying it. Linguists tore the grammar apart. Historians questioned the lack of supporting evidence. Geologists noted that the stones looked remarkably fresh for ancient relics. Eventually, Wyrick died under a cloud of doubt and depression. Some say he was a dupe. Others suspect he was the mastermind. Either way, the Newark Holy Stones were largely dismissed as fabrications. Yet they linger. Like all good hoaxes, they refuse to die completely. They live on in pseudo-historical books, in fringe documentaries, in late-night YouTube spirals, where ancient Israel somehow always ends up in Ohio. And the next chapter in this saga gets even weirder, when the lost colony of Roanoke allegedly left behind carved messages on river stones in the Carolina woods. 6. The Dare Stones. In the late 1930s, a California man named Lewis Hammond walked into Emory University with a stone in his hand and a wild story to tell. The stone, he claimed, had been found in the woods near the Chowan River in North Carolina. It bore an eerie message carved in what looked like Elizabethan English. A grave account from Eleanor Dare, one of the missing settlers from the lost Roanoke colony. On the stone, Ananias Dare and Virginia went hence unto heaven, 1591, it read. Ye Englishmen show this unto John White, governor of Roanoke in Virginia. It was haunting, personal, tragic, and most of all, it seemed real. This stone was just the beginning. Over the next few years, more than 40 additional stones emerged. They painted a grim odyssey of disease, death, and desperate wandering, of betrayal by native groups and the slow unraveling of the last surviving colonists. These Dare Stones, as they came to be known, laid out a narrative too cinematic to ignore. a lost chapter of American history recovered, one granite sentence at a time. For a brief window of time, the academic world took them seriously. Magazines ran with it. Radio shows speculated. Schools debated the stones in classrooms. The possibility that Eleanor Dare had chronicled her colony's demise stone by stone, like a prehistoric Twitter feed, was as horrifying as it was irresistible. Then came the scrutiny. Language experts tore into the phrasing. Some stones used contractions that didn't exist in the 16th century. Others had punctuation habits that screamed 20th century forgery. And strangest of all, most of the new stones were turning up in Georgia, hundreds of miles off course, and often by people who seemed a little too enthusiastic about discovering them. Eventually, a journalistic investigation outed the whole affair. A stonecutter in Georgia confessed to faking many of them. The timeline, the methods, the motivations, all of it pointed to an elaborate hoax that had spun out of control. Only the original stone, the first one Hammond brought in, remained remotely plausible. Even today, some scholars argue that that first stone might be genuine, but the rest? A cautionary tale of belief outpacing evidence and of how badly we want to hear voices from the past, even if we have to carve them ourselves. And speaking of invented origins, the next ancient artifact came not from stone, but from an entire invented mythos, one man's attempt to write a Native American origin story from scratch, with some creative liberties. 7. The Walam Olum. It began, like most good myths do, in a basement full of artifacts no one asked for. In 1836, a man named Constantine Samuel Rafinesque, a self-styled polymath, linguist, botanist, and occasional delusional romantic, claimed he had uncovered the lost creation story of the Lenape, a Native American tribe from the northeastern woodlands. It was called the Walam Olum, or Red Record, and it told an epic tale of ancient migrations across the Bering Strait, of a great serpent flood, of wars and wanderings in sacred memory carved onto wooden tablets. Rafinesque said he had found these engraved tablets, as well as their translations, from a mysterious unnamed Delaware man. The symbols, he explained, were Lenape pictographs, and with his unrivaled knowledge of native languages, he had managed to decipher them. He published his findings with great fanfare. Anthropologists and early American historians clung to it like a cultural lifeline. Finally, a native epic that mirrored Homer or Gilgamesh. Finally, proof that American soil had its own mythic canon. There was just one problem. It wasn't real. No one had ever seen the original tablets. The supposed Delaware source never existed, and the Lenape language Rafinesque translated, a mangled blend of bad etymology, hopeful guesswork, and creative fiction. The deeper linguistic experts dug, the clearer it became that the Walam Olum wasn't an ancient origin story. It was Rafinesque's origin story, an Enlightenment fantasy dressed in indigenous garb. But for decades it persisted. Why? Because it offered an easy myth, one that made Native American history look like a tidy migration saga, conveniently paralleling European origin stories. It helped early Americans reconcile conquest with curiosity. See, they could say, we're just rediscovering what they already knew. In the mid-20th century, scholars finally put the nail in the coffin. Linguistic analysis confirmed that the text's grammar was artificial. The pictographs were inconsistent and borrowed from multiple cultures. No Lenape elders recognized the story, and yet, some still cite the Walam Olum as if it's a real oral tradition, because it feels ancient even if it isn't. And just when you think the pseudo-archaeology couldn't get any bolder, a man in Michigan decided to bury boxes full of fake relics, sit back, and wait for academia to eat itself. 8. The Michigan Relics. Imagine being an archaeologist in the late 1800s. You're excavating a field in Michigan, brushing away soil, when you stumble across a strange artifact, a carved clay tablet inscribed with odd symbols. Then another, then dozens, and soon you're standing on a gold mine of ancient history, or so you think. This was the reality in the 1890s, when hundreds of bizarre artifacts began turning up across Michigan. Tablets, tools, pipes, amulets, all carved with crude images and an indecipherable alphabet. Some depicted biblical scenes. Others showed hybrid symbols, part Egyptian, part Sumerian, part something else entirely. It looked like the ruins of a forgotten global super-civilization buried beneath the American heartland. Or it looked like someone got really into arts and crafts. The artifacts were quickly dubbed the Michigan Relics. Their discoverer, a local man named James Scotford, claimed he had stumbled upon them while digging post holes. He just kept finding more, almost as if the earth itself wanted to rewrite history. As word spread, a businessman named Daniel Soper, a former Michigan Secretary of State who had resigned in disgrace, always a promising resume, joined the cause and helped promote the relics far and wide. Museums took notice. Clergy got excited. A few fringe scholars insisted the artifacts proved pre-Columbian contact with the Old World, maybe even ties to the lost tribes of Israel. Sound familiar? But real archaeologists weren't buying it. The material was too soft, too new. The engravings were sloppy and inconsistent. And crucially, the symbols didn't match any known ancient script, or each other. Experts soon exposed the relics as modern forgeries, likely made using homemade molds and ceramic clay. Despite that, Soper and Scotford kept digging, and mysteriously kept finding more. How lucky. Eventually, the whole enterprise collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. Scotford's family later admitted he had created many of the relics in his workshop. But by then, the damage was done. The Michigan relics had already infiltrated museums and private collections across the country. They still show up in online auction houses today, like relics from an alternate version of history where logic took the decade off. And just when you thought the artifacts couldn't get more ridiculous, someone decided to chisel a scene of mammoth hunting onto a stone and pass it off as Native American memory. 9. The Lenny Lenape stone picture. It's the late 1800s, and the public is hungry for archaeological thrills. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a man named Barnard Hansel unearthed what seemed to be the holy grail of prehistoric storytelling. A small engraved slate stone showing a Native American figure throwing a spear at a woolly mammoth. It was a perfect match for the national mood. The newly discovered Ice Age was all the rage. People were just beginning to understand that humans had coexisted with extinct megafauna, and this little rock was like a hand-drawn postcard from the distant past. Hansel brought the stone to a local historical society, where it was examined with a mix of reverence and confusion. The carving was crude but evocative. The mammoth's curly tusks were unmistakable, the spear-throwing figure heroic. It looked like history's earliest hunting manual, but it also looked suspicious. For one, the stone had no provenance, no documentation, no supporting context, no surrounding tools or bones. It simply appeared, like most hoaxes do, at the perfect time, in the perfect place, with the perfect message. Secondly, the carving style didn't match known native petroglyphs or artistic traditions. The lines were too shallow, the wear was inconsistent, and the mammoth's features bore more resemblance to 19th century illustrations than anything from oral tradition. Still, some took it seriously. The idea that Native Americans had documented their own Pleistocene history in stone was both thrilling and politically convenient. It elevated their past, ironically, in a way that made it easier to erase their present. Eventually, most experts dismissed the Lenny Lenape stone as a hoax, likely created by someone trying to cash in on public interest in Ice Age America. But like the other fakes before it, it refused to fully disappear. It still pops up in conspiracy forums and books with titles like Ancient Mysteries of the Americas, where mammoth-chasing warriors run alongside Atlanteans and ancient astronauts. And if Hebrew wasn't ancient enough, the next artifact dialed it up another level, featuring yet more sacred inscriptions, a dead language, and one suspiciously well-timed dig in a Tennessee burial mound. 10. The Bat Creek Stone. In 1889, during an official excavation of Native American burial mounds in Tennessee, the Smithsonian Institution unearthed something unexpected. A small stone inscribed with ancient characters. It was found buried beneath the head of a skeleton in a sealed tomb, a detail that lent it a sort of ceremonial weight. The archaeologist in charge, John Emmert, labeled the stone as containing Cherokee writing, an exciting if confusing claim. After all, the Cherokee syllabary had only been developed in the 19th century. So how did it get underground centuries earlier? Then came the twist. Years later, a scholar re-examined the inscription and noticed something strange. It wasn't Cherokee at all. It looked a lot like ancient Hebrew. In fact, it looked exactly like Paleo-Hebrew, the kind used during the First Temple period in biblical Israel. Cue the chorus. Supporters of the Lost Tribes of Israel theory saw this as definitive proof. According to their logic, ancient Israelites had crossed the Atlantic, settled in America, and were eventually absorbed into the indigenous population. It was one of those theories that stitched together just enough myth, nationalism, and archaeology to make people feel like they'd discovered something profound. Or at least publishable. The Bat Creek stone was suddenly elevated from quirky artifact to theological dynamite. Books were written. Lectures were held. Museums quietly adjusted their labels. But as always, the scrutiny came next. And it was brutal. Linguists noticed that the ancient Paleo-Hebrew inscription matched letter for letter with a modern 19th century Hebrew primer available in Emmert's time. Not just in general content, but in typographic layout. In other words, someone had copied it directly. Worse still, the characters were upside down in early photos, suggesting they'd been misinterpreted from the start. And then there was Emmert himself. A troubled employee of the Smithsonian with a history of drinking and missed deadlines, Emmert had strong motives to produce an impressive find. The stone, critics argued, wasn't a mystery. It was a job-saving invention, planted in the grave by the very man who reported it. Today, even the Smithsonian officially lists the Bat Creek stone as a probable hoax. And yet it continues to have believers. Because to some, the allure of a secret biblical America is more comforting than the complexities of real history. But if stones could lie, so could scrolls. And one Russian document, forged and hateful, would find new life in America and cause damage far beyond archaeology. 11. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Imagine a document that purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting of global elites, plotting to control the press, undermine religion, corrupt morals, and dominate the world economy. Now imagine that this document is taken at face value by millions, used to justify discrimination, violence, and suspicion for more than a century. That's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. A forgery so effective, it transcended its origins and mutated into a global myth. The document first appeared in Russia in the early 1900s, cooked up by Tsarist secret police as a way to deflect public anger. It plagiarized freely from earlier political satires, mixing conspiracy and paranoia into a dark vision of global control, falsely attributed to Jewish leaders. It was, in essence, a literary booby trap, designed to ignite fear and justify repression. But here's the American twist. By the 1920s, the protocols had crossed the Atlantic and found fertile ground. Industrialist Henry Ford, yes, that Henry Ford, bankrolled the publication and distribution of the text in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. He printed it in multiple languages. He mailed it out across the country. He even compiled it into a book series titled The International Jew. Ford later apologized under public pressure, but the damage was done. The idea that a shadowy cabal controlled the world had gone mainstream. The protocols wormed their way into churches, political speeches, and dinner table conversations. They were cited as evidence for restrictive immigration policies and cultural distrust. And despite repeated debunkings, including court cases, journalistic exposes, and official condemnations, the text refused to die. Why? Because it answered a dangerous question. Why is the world so unfair? The protocols offered a simple and false answer. People didn't have to look inward or question complex systems. They could just blame a scapegoat. The appeal was never factual. It was emotional. And for a nation as obsessed with secret societies and elite conspiracies as early 20th century America, it was the perfect ideological parasite. Today, the protocols are universally discredited by historians. But they still circulate, sometimes repackaged, sometimes rebranded, in the dusty corners of the internet and the shiny platforms of populist pundits. As always, fake history has a longer shelf life than truth, especially when it flatters our worst suspicions. And if fake documents could alter geopolitics, imagine what forged diaries, claiming to belong to the most reviled man in modern history, could do to the credibility of historians. 12. The Hitler Diaries. In 1983, a storm of anticipation swept through the publishing world. German news magazine Stern had just acquired what it believed were Adolf Hitler's personal diaries, a trove of over 60 notebooks chronicling his innermost thoughts from 1932 to 1945. They were set to rock the historical world. And in America, publishers and historians scrambled for translations, film rights, and expert commentary. The sheer scale of the find was intoxicating. Here perhaps was the intimate Hitler, not the barking demagogue of newsreels, but the private man. Scholars speculated what insights might emerge. Was he conflicted? Remorseful? Delusional? Could this humanize the monster? Or make him even more terrifying? The excitement was short-lived. Within weeks of publication, historians began to notice issues. The paper was too new. The bindings were wrong. And the handwriting? Suspiciously inconsistent. Forensic analysis revealed that the ink hadn't even finished drying, metaphorically speaking. Enter Konrad Kujau, a German forger with a flair for drama and a taste for memorabilia. He had created the diaries from scratch, blending passages from actual Hitler speeches with invented reflections. The language was stilted, the tone off. It read like bad fan fiction for fascists. And yet, major institutions, including stern and respected historians, had been fooled, not because the evidence was good, but because they wanted it to be. They wanted to be the ones who unearthed the lost voice of history. They wanted access to the ultimate forbidden archive, and in that desire, their skepticism failed. American historians were swept up too. Some offered premature validations. Others backpedaled as the hoax unraveled. It was a moment of collective academic embarrassment, and a reminder that no one, not even the gatekeepers of historical truth, is immune to being conned. The Hitler Diaries are now taught in journalism schools as a cautionary tale about due diligence, about ego, about the dangerous hunger to find what no one else has found. But if forging the personal thoughts of history's most infamous villain wasn't bold enough, the next scam would target one of America's richest men, turning an entire autobiography into an elaborate televised lie. 13. The Howard Hughes Autobiography. In the early 1970s, one of the most eccentric billionaires in American history became the unwitting co-author of a book he never wrote. Howard Hughes, reclusive tycoon, aviation legend, and walking symbol of post-war American paranoia, had vanished from public view. He hadn't been seen in years. He communicated only through intermediaries. He was the perfect ghost. And Clifford Irving saw an opportunity. Irving was a struggling novelist with a flair for invention and a severe allergy to obscurity. In 1971, he announced that he had struck gold, a secret personal arrangement with Howard Hughes to co-write his autobiography. According to Irving, Hughes had reached out to him through mysterious channels, entrusting him with his life story, the only story Hughes would ever authorize. This was catnip to publishers. McGraw-Hill handed over a massive advance. Time magazine prepped a cover story. Legal teams drew up contracts. Irving even produced handwritten notes and letters from Hughes himself. The handwriting experts? Fooled. The publishing world? Hooked. The literary scene? Ablaze. There was just one missing detail. None of it was true. Hughes had never contacted Irving. There was no secret collaboration, no confessional narrative, no stack of dictated memoirs. Irving had faked the letters, faked the signatures, and fabricated the entire relationship. He even traveled to Mexico with his wife, who opened a Swiss bank account under a false name to collect the payments, all while pretending that the billionaire author was hiding behind a curtain somewhere. And it might have worked, had Hughes not decided, in a rare moment of public visibility, to intervene. In 1972, Hughes made a surprise phone call to a group of journalists. His voice crackled over the speakerphone from a hotel suite in the Bahamas. Calmly and methodically, he dismantled the claims. "I don't know this man," Hughes said. "I've never met him. I've never even heard of him." That was the end of the con, and the beginning of a federal investigation. Irving was arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison for fraud. His elaborate literary heist had collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. But in a strange twist of cultural irony, the hoax only increased public fascination with Hughes. The real man remained elusive. The fake version briefly became the more compelling character. And when it comes to fabricated documents used to shape political and religious power, Irving was just the latest in a very long line. One of the oldest and most absurd examples had been haunting history books for centuries. A fake Roman imperial decree that somehow survived into colonial America. 14. The donation of Constantine. If you've ever wondered how a forged document from the 8th century managed to influence American thought in the 18th, look no further than the donation of Constantine. It was, on the surface, an official imperial decree from Emperor Constantine the Great. The document claimed that Constantine, after being miraculously cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, granted the Pope control over Rome, all of Italy, and basically half the known world. Power. Bestowed from throne to altar. The catch? Constantine never wrote it. He never signed it. He never even thought it. The donation was forged centuries after his death, likely by someone in the papal bureaucracy looking to retroactively legitimize the growing political power of the Catholic Church. And for a long time, it worked. The document was used for nearly 1,000 years to justify papal supremacy over kings, land, and laws. Popes cited it. Monarchs bowed to it. It gave the Church not just spiritual authority, but feudal might. Fast forward to the Reformation and the Enlightenment thinkers who followed. They dissected the donation with glee. Lorenzo Valla, a Renaissance scholar, famously tore it apart using textual analysis in the 15th century, proving it was a fake. But by then, the damage was done. So how did it survive into American consciousness? Because early colonial America was still deeply shaped by European religious institutions, particularly Catholic schools and seminaries. The donation was taught, debated, and in some fringe corners, still believed. Some American religious texts and sermons even referenced it as evidence of divine providence moving through history. A narrative that conveniently positioned Western civilization as the chosen vehicle for God's empire-building project. By the time the Founding Fathers were writing constitutions and declarations, the donation was largely dismissed by serious historians. But its ghost lingered. It had helped train generations of Americans to think of religion and political authority as inherently fused, a mindset that proved surprisingly durable. And just when America was beginning to separate church and state, a strange myth surfaced, not from Rome, but from Virginia, involving one of its most revered founders and a supposedly scandalous Bible he kept under wraps. 15. The Jefferson Bible rediscovery myth. Thomas Jefferson was many things: philosopher, architect, farmer, and the world's most reluctant theocrat. His personal views on religion were skeptical at best. He once wrote that the book of Revelation was the ravings of a maniac. But one of his most peculiar side projects involved crafting a Bible. By subtraction, Jefferson's so-called Bible was his edited version of the New Testament. painstakingly compiled with scissors and glue. He removed all references to miracles, divinity, and supernatural events. What remained was a condensed version of Jesus' teachings, stripped of magic, myth, and resurrection. No water into wine, no walking on water. Just the ethics. He called it the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And for years it stayed relatively obscure, until someone decided to invent a rediscovery myth around it. In the mid-20th century, the Jefferson Bible was framed by some as a hidden text. One Jefferson was allegedly too afraid to publish. According to this narrative, Jefferson hid it from the public out of fear that it would ruin his political career or scandalize the deeply religious electorate. It was portrayed as a bombshell, rediscovered in dusty archives, revealing the true Jefferson. Except that's not what happened. Jefferson never tried to hide it. In fact, he proudly gave copies to friends. He referred to it openly in letters. He didn't print it widely, sure, but that had more to do with practicality and his personal sense of modesty than fear of backlash. The rediscovery was manufactured to give the Bible more intrigue, by casting it as a suppressed document, a censored gospel of reason. It became more marketable. Fringe historians and secular groups used it to paint Jefferson as a radical iconoclast fighting against religious tyranny. Religious critics, meanwhile, weaponized it as proof of Jefferson's alleged moral failings. In truth, the Jefferson Bible was just a personal project, a philosophical experiment. He never meant it as a public manifesto, and certainly not as a theological revolution. The myth of its suppression says more about America's cultural anxieties than it does about Jefferson himself. And speaking of invented documents designed to flatter powerful egos, the next hoax involves a fake fan letter from one dictator to one automaker, and how both of them believed it might be real. 16. The Hitler letter to Ford. In 1924, a curious letter began circulating that would link two of the 20th century's most polarizing figures, Adolf Hitler and Henry Ford. According to the letter, Hitler had personally written to Ford to express admiration for his anti-Jewish writings and his industrial success. The contents were brief, but deeply flattering. In Hitler's words, allegedly, Ford was the only American with a real understanding of the Jewish question. It was the kind of praise that no American businessman should ever want, but Ford, strangely, didn't disavow it. In fact, he seemed to accept it. And so did many others. The letter was widely reported and quickly took on a life of its own. Newspapers ran it as a shocking yet somehow credible document. After all, Ford had published anti-Semitic content in the Dearborn Independent for years. His series of essays, later compiled into the infamous The International Jew, had become required reading in certain circles of European extremism. Hitler even mentioned Ford by name in Mein Kampf, calling him a single great man who resisted Jewish influence in industry and politics. So the logic went, of course Hitler wrote to him. Why wouldn't he? But here's the catch. There is no surviving original, no verifiable copy, no paper trail, no archive. The Hitler to Ford letter is almost certainly a fabrication, or at best an apocryphal bit of myth-making that blurred into accepted history through repetition. Even during Ford's lifetime there was doubt. Some researchers pointed out inconsistencies in how the letter was cited. Others couldn't find any corroborating evidence that Hitler had actually sent it. But by then, the letter had become a cultural artifact. It confirmed what many feared, that American industrialists and European fascists weren't just ideologically aligned, but actively corresponding. For Ford, the letter was an embarrassment he never fully confronted. He eventually shut down the Dearborn Independent and issued a weak public apology, claiming he hadn't known what was being printed in his name. But he never went out of his way to refute the Hitler letter. Whether it was due to guilt, indifference, or pride, no one can say. What's more unsettling is how quickly the letter passed from rumor to reality, because sometimes all a myth needs is for people not to question it too loudly. And when it came to myths, few were as persistent or bizarre as the idea that Native Americans were actually Israelites in disguise, wandering the wilderness in buckskin and prophecy. 17. The Lost Tribes Theory. In the early chapters of American religious history, before televangelists and tent revivals, there was an obsession with one specific mystery, the fate of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. According to biblical lore, these tribes were exiled and disappeared from history after the Assyrian conquest. No one knew where they went, which, for a certain kind of imagination, meant they could be literally anywhere. Cue the early settlers and revivalists who arrived in the New World and encountered Native American tribes with complex cultures, oral histories, and religious systems. To them, these weren't indigenous peoples. They were descendants of Hebrews, of ancient prophecy, of Abraham himself. This wasn't just idle speculation. It was printed in sermons, taught in schools, and published in religious tracts. Cotton Mather, one of the original American firebrands, believed it. So did James Adair, a trader and pseudo-ethnographer who spent years among the Cherokee and wrote a lengthy book claiming that native customs mirrored Old Testament traditions. To support the theory, proponents pointed to everything from tribal burial customs to linguistic quirks. They claimed native names sounded vaguely Hebrew, that animal sacrifices resembled ancient rituals, and that tribal elders were secretly practicing lost Mosaic law. Never mind that these interpretations were often wildly inaccurate. They fit the narrative, and that was enough. Why did this myth catch fire? Because it conveniently erased the complexity of native cultures while elevating them to biblical status. It allowed colonizers to feel like they were interacting not with a foreign civilization, but with estranged cousins from the Holy Land. It also offered a moral loophole. If Native Americans were Israelites, then converting or civilizing them was a form of spiritual homecoming, not cultural erasure. The lost tribes theory persisted well into the 19th century and even helped inspire fringe religious movements, including early Mormon teachings. It shaped how Americans thought about race, origin, and divine purpose. It offered a spiritual explanation for colonization, one that didn't require too much introspection. Modern archaeology, anthropology, and genetics have long since dismissed the theory. There is zero evidence, linguistic, cultural, or genetic, that Native Americans descended from ancient Israelites. But the appeal of the story lingers in certain circles, where ancient maps and sacred stones are still presented as proof. And when it comes to sacred visions, nothing beat the next hoax, a patriotic fever dream in which George Washington, freezing at Valley Forge, received a divine preview of America's glorious future. Spoiler, he did not. 18. George Washington's vision at Valley Forge. Somewhere between patriotic folklore and historical fan fiction lies one of the strangest myths ever attached to America's first president. According to a popular 19th century account, George Washington had a supernatural experience while encamped at Valley Forge during the brutal winter of 1777-1778. As the story goes, he was visited by a radiant female spirit, possibly an angel, who revealed to him a series of prophetic visions about the future of the United States. In this dreamlike sequence, Washington supposedly saw 3 great perils that would test the nation: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and a third, unnamed apocalypse where foreign armies would invade and America would be saved only by divine intervention. The message was clear. The United States was chosen, blessed, and protected. A literal holy nation. Cue the flags, choirs, and Instagram quotes. The vision was first published decades after Washington's death, in the National Tribune in 1880, a newspaper aimed at Civil War veterans. The article claimed it was based on the recollections of an old soldier named Anthony Sherman, who allegedly witnessed the general immediately after his celestial encounter. Historians have scoured the records. Anthony Sherman never appears in muster rolls. No one at Valley Forge recorded anything remotely similar. And Washington, a meticulous diary keeper, never mentioned a mystical prophecy in his life. The style of the vision, overly poetic, quasi-biblical, and laden with moral symbolism, bears all the hallmarks of 19th century revivalist fiction. And yet, The myth persisted. The tale was republished in Christian newsletters, war memorial speeches, and patriotic children's books. It became a kind of American gospel. Washington, the warrior prophet, chosen by heaven to shepherd the republic through fire and blood. In modern times, it's been revived in conspiracy circles and end-times prophecy videos. Despite being thoroughly debunked by every serious biographer, it still gets cited by those who want a divine origin story for the American experiment. It says something about the nation's collective imagination, that we'd rather believe George Washington was speaking with angels than acknowledge that he was a tired, cold, frustrated general trying to keep starving men alive. And speaking of imaginary ancestors, the next hoax involves a discovery that shook the foundations of evolutionary science. A missing link so perfect, so convenient, it took decades to admit it was built from a monkey's jaw and a man's skull. 19. The Piltdown Man. In the early 20th century, the question of human origins was a kind of scientific gold rush. Evolutionary theory had become mainstream, but the fossil record was still tantalizingly incomplete. Scientists were desperate for that one missing link, the fossil that would show the transition from ape to human, from fur to philosophy. Enter Piltdown Man, a skull so perfect it had to be real. And that was exactly the problem. The story begins in 1912, when Charles Dawson, an amateur archaeologist with a flair for drama, announced that he'd discovered fragments of a skull in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. The remains were remarkable, a human-like cranium paired with an ape-like jaw. It was exactly what scientists thought they were looking for, the bridge between species. The creature was dubbed Eoanthropus dawsoni, or Dawson's Dawn Man. Though the discovery wasn't American, it had immediate ripple effects across the Atlantic. American museums hailed it as a triumph. Textbooks featured it prominently. U.S. scientists cited Piltdown as validation of evolutionary theory. And conveniently, it confirmed a very British kind of human ancestor. Big brain first, everything else second. In other words, intelligence was the seed, and everything else followed. There were whispers, of course. Some thought the jaw looked too modern. Others noted that the teeth had been oddly filed. But skepticism was drowned out by excitement. For decades, Piltdown Man held court in institutions and lecture halls. Then came the 1950s. New dating methods and chemical analyses revealed the truth. Piltdown Man was a composite forgery. The skull was human, about 600 years old. The jaw belonged to an orangutan, and someone had deliberately stained both pieces to make them look ancient. The teeth? Filed down to match. The scientific world was humiliated. For over 40 years, one of the most prestigious discoveries in paleoanthropology had been a hoax, and a rather clumsy one at that. The British scientific establishment took the brunt of the fall, but American science didn't escape unscathed. After all, U.S. scholars had echoed the falsehood, republished the data, and reinforced the mistake. The hoax forced a major reckoning in the field. It also reminded everyone, painfully, that even scientists could be swayed by nationalism, vanity, and wishful thinking. And as it turns out, false letters and fake fossils weren't the only lies floating around. In the early days of email and chain letters, a new myth was born. One that claimed the Founding Fathers weren't just patriots, but something far more sinister. 20. The Satanic Founding Fathers letters. In the 1990s, before social media but after fax machines, a peculiar letter began making the rounds. It claimed to reveal a dark secret buried deep within America's origins. That key founding fathers, specifically Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, had been members of a satanic cult. The evidence? Alleged suppressed letters, hidden symbols, and conveniently vague references to rituals performed in shadowy European societies. The letter, usually anonymous, claimed to have been written by a brave whistleblower, often a pastor, an ex-Freemason, or an unnamed scholar. It was always framed the same way. The truth had been hidden, but now, in these end times, it had to be revealed. The letter typically urged recipients to pass it on, turning it into an early form of viral content. Church groups passed copies around. Religious talk shows mentioned it with a knowing wink. The internet, still clunky, still wrapped in modem screeches, was just beginning to carry these claims further. The central accusation was that Franklin and Jefferson had been involved in satanic rituals during their time in Europe, possibly tied to secret societies like the Hellfire Club or shadowy Enlightenment circles. There were references to bizarre symbols on the dollar bill, to mysterious bones found in Franklin's London home, and to Jefferson's alleged disdain for Christianity as evidence of deeper moral corruption. It all sounded scandalous, and that was the point. But once again, the truth was much more mundane. The bones found beneath Franklin's former residence in London. Archaeological studies revealed they belonged to cadavers used in medical research. Franklin had shared the house with a surgeon. The letters referencing secret societies were either misquoted or completely fabricated. And while Jefferson was indeed skeptical of organized religion, there's zero historical evidence linking him or Franklin to any kind of satanic practice. Still, the hoax had legs. Why? Because it fit a growing narrative in certain religious and conspiracy-minded communities, that America had been founded not as a Christian nation, but as a masquerade, a false republic hiding dark pagan roots. The founders weren't enlightened deists. They were occultists in powdered wigs. These letters were never traced to a single source. They likely mutated over time. Part urban legend, part disinformation, part sincere misunderstanding of Enlightenment weirdness. But they proved that even centuries later, America's founding myths were still ripe for reinvention. And while forged letters could spark suspicion, fake cures could do real damage. Which brings us to a man who promised eternal vitality through goat surgery, and charged handsomely for the pleasure. 21. The Goat Testicle Cure. John Brinkley. In the strange medical frontier of early 20th century America, quackery wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a career path, and no one rode that path with more confidence or less ethics than Dr. John R. Brinkley. Brinkley's claim to fame was both simple and outrageous. He believed that transplanting goat testicles into human men would restore virility, cure impotence, and generally make life worth living again. He called it a miracle. Critics called it a sideshow. But patients? They called it worth the price. And there were many. Brinkley wasn't a real doctor, at least not in any accredited sense. His medical degree came from a diploma mill. But he understood something deeper than science. Marketing. He opened a clinic in Kansas, hired actors to pose as satisfied patients, and launched aggressive ad campaigns. His pitch? Scientific revolution with a touch of livestock. The procedure was absurd. Brinkley would surgically implant goat glands into human bodies. Mostly men, but sometimes women too. There was no scientific basis, no testing, no oversight. But the testimonials poured in. Men claimed they felt younger, stronger, more alive. Whether that was placebo, adrenaline, or sheer desperation is still debated. By the 1920s, Brinkley was rich. His hospital became a pilgrimage site for the hopeful and the gullible. He even ran for governor of Kansas, twice, and nearly won. He built one of the first high-power radio stations in America, broadcasting his medical claims to millions. His radio show featured hillbilly music, phony testimonials, and endless ads for goat gland miracles. But eventually, the truth caught up. Medical boards investigated. Journalists exposed him. The American Medical Association labeled him a dangerous fraud. Patients began to suffer complications, infections, scarring, and in some cases, death. Brinkley was sued, banned, and stripped of his medical license. But he never quite went away. He relocated to Texas and continued his work with fewer scruples and louder broadcasts. Brinkley's story is less about medical science and more about the American willingness to believe, especially when hope is packaged with charisma and a little rural flair. He promised vitality in a bottle, or rather, in a goat. And thousands bought it. Even after his death in 1942, Brinkley's legacy lived on. He helped lay the foundation for modern medical fraud, for the wellness industrial complex, for the idea that if science won't save you, something else, exotic, unregulated, and probably from a farm, will. And speaking of radioactive ideas, the next miracle cure involved glowing water, toxic optimism, and the slow realization that maybe not all science is good science. 22. The cure for cancer from radium water. Once upon a time, in the twilight of the Industrial Revolution, there was a glow in the dark, and people drank it, literally. In the 1920s, radium was the wonder element of the age. Discovered just a few decades prior by the Curies, it had that perfect blend of mystery and sparkle. It glowed in the dark. It gave off heat. And, according to some enterprising salesman, it could cure pretty much anything: arthritis, fatigue, aging, and yes, even cancer. Enter the bizarre world of radium water. Among its loudest promoters was Eben Byers, a wealthy American industrialist and amateur golfer with more money than caution. He began consuming a tonic called Radithor, a solution of distilled water and radium isotopes touted as a certified radioactive water by its equally enthusiastic inventor, William J. A. Bailey. Bailey wasn't a medical doctor. He was a Harvard dropout with a knack for pseudoscience and marketing, a familiar combination. Byers began taking Radithor regularly, not just a few sips either. He drank it by the crate, sometimes up to 3 bottles a day. He claimed it gave him energy, vitality, even improved his athletic performance. His endorsements helped push Radithor into the mainstream. Wealthy elites and even physicians joined the radium craze. Radioactive toothpaste, radium facial creams, radium condoms. The list went on. But the human body has a different opinion about radioactive isotopes. At first, the effects were subtle: headaches, bone pain, fatigue. Then, the real consequences began to show. Byers' jaw started deteriorating. His bones weakened. Holes formed in his skull. Radiation sickness had set in, slowly and invisibly, masquerading as rejuvenation until it was too late. Byers died in 1932, not of cancer, but of radium poisoning, a painful, drawn-out collapse that revealed the horrifying truth. The cure was the disease. The scandal rocked the public. The government finally cracked down on radioactive tonics. The FDA began regulating medicines that made fantastical claims. Bailey, the man behind Radithor, escaped criminal charges but died of bladder cancer himself. Irony, as always, had the final word, but even after the Byers case, belief in radium as a miracle cure didn't vanish overnight. The glow still held cultural weight. It took decades before Americans stopped associating radioactivity with progress and started seeing it for what it could really be: beautiful, mysterious, and quietly lethal. And if selling liquid radiation to the public wasn't bold enough, the next great hoax promised to fix everything, all with a little machine and a lot of ozone. 23. The ozone machine scams. If radium was the magic word of the 1920s, then ozone was the scientific hocus-pocus of the early 20th century's alternative medicine scene. It was the era of electrocution therapy, magnetized water, and people who genuinely believed that standing in copper pyramids could unlock cosmic secrets. In that fertile soil, ozone machines sprouted like weeds. The pitch was deceptively simple. Ozone, the molecule composed of 3 oxygen atoms, is a natural purifier. It kills bacteria. It freshens air. It smells like cleanliness itself. So what if, the thinking went, you could harness that purifying power and channel it into the human body? Enter the ozone machine, a device designed to infuse the body with activated oxygen. There were at-home models, spa-sized contraptions, even portable kits. Some blew ozone into bathwater. Others sent it into your ears or up your nose. Still others were more invasive, all in the name of health. The machines were sleek, brass-trimmed, full of spinning dials and whirring coils, pseudoscience with the aesthetic of a steampunk fever dream. Their creators claimed ozone could cure virtually everything: tuberculosis, asthma, cancer, diabetes, syphilis, baldness, depression, poor circulation, bad posture, and spiritual fatigue. It was a medical Swiss Army knife, and the fact that no one could quite explain how it worked only made it more magical. Doctors were divided. Some early practitioners saw mild benefits from ozone therapy and sterilizing wounds or dental tools, legitimate uses in controlled settings. But these machines were something else entirely. They weren't about sterilization. They were about salvation, and they sold like snake oil. Testimonials flooded in, mostly from people with chronic illnesses or vague, untraceable ailments. Many reported feeling better. Maybe they were. Maybe the placebo effect was working overtime. Maybe breathing a bunch of oxidants did something temporary. But eventually, the long-term effects spoke louder than the brochures. Prolonged ozone exposure is not great for the lungs. It causes inflammation, reduces oxygen uptake, and can actually damage the respiratory system. The very thing marketed as a life-giver could, over time, compromise your ability to breathe. The FDA and AMA began cracking down. Investigations were launched, warnings issued. But the machines never really died. They simply evolved. Even today, ozone therapy has its fringe adherents. Some wellness clinics offer it as a detox method. Some athletes experiment with it. Some online biohackers swear by it, because the rule is eternal. If it has knobs, glows faintly, and makes no scientific sense, someone will call it a miracle. And speaking of miracles in a bottle, the next scandal came with international headlines, a Nobel Prize-level buzz, and an experiment so promising that the world held its breath, then watched, awkwardly, as it fizzled into nothing. 24. The Cold Fusion Announcement. March 23, 1989. Two chemists, Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Pons, stood before the world and made an announcement that sent shockwaves through science and energy policy alike. They claimed they had achieved cold fusion, that is, nuclear fusion at room temperature. To translate, they were saying they had found a way to generate massive amounts of clean, cheap energy using a simple lab setup, a glass jar, some palladium electrodes, heavy water, a few wires, no billion-dollar reactors, no superheated plasma, just fusion, the process that powers the sun, in a teacup. If true, it would mean an end to the energy crisis. No more fossil fuels, no more nuclear waste, no more geopolitical squabbling over oil, just infinite energy, on demand. The media exploded. "Breakthrough of the century," screamed headlines. The Department of Energy launched inquiries. Research labs across the world scrambled to replicate the experiment. Fleischmann and Pons were suddenly global celebrities. And then, nothing. Other scientists couldn't reproduce the results. The energy output wasn't consistent. The effect, if it existed at all, was vanishingly small. Explanations started trickling in. Perhaps it was a measurement error. Perhaps it was electrolysis gone weird. Perhaps it was wishful thinking with a particle budget. By the summer, the excitement had turned sour. Skeptics sharpened their knives. The scientific community, once cautiously intrigued, began to close ranks. Conferences were canceled. Funding dried up. The term cold fusion became a punchline, shorthand for premature celebration and sloppy science. Fleischmann and Pons were marginalized. They relocated to Europe and faded from the mainstream, still insisting they had seen something real. And maybe they had. But the scientific method isn't kind to those who rush their press releases. Cold fusion became one of the most infamous examples of overhyped science in modern history. It wasn't a hoax in the traditional sense. Not deliberate deception, perhaps, but rather a tragic blend of ambition, pressure, and self-delusion. And yet, the idea never fully died. Every few years, someone claims to have cracked it. Low-energy nuclear reactions is the new name. The dreams persist, because the fantasy of limitless energy is eternal. And if you tell people they can have everything for nothing, they'll listen, at least for a while. Next came a different kind of scientific illusion. Not promising energy, but a brand new state of water that defied the laws of physics. It smelled like sweat. It disappeared under scrutiny. And for a brief moment, it was the future. 25. The Polywater Scare. In the 1960s, as the Cold War quietly heated every corner of science, a group of Soviet researchers stumbled onto something odd. It wasn't glowing. It didn't explode. It wasn't even dangerous, technically. It was just water. But wrong. They called it polywater. This new version of H2O wasn't like the kind that filled your teacup. Polywater was denser, more viscous, with a higher boiling point and a lower freezing point. It was water, they insisted, but with its molecules arranged in long chains. Polymerized water. Hence, polywater. Soviet scientists speculated it could be a new state of matter, possibly the key to advanced materials or biological breakthroughs. The potential implications were enormous. And predictably, the U.S. took notice. American labs scrambled to replicate it. And for a while, some did. Or said they did. Publications began emerging on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Journalists breathlessly reported that science might have unlocked a new fundamental building block of life. Polywater could change everything. Storage, agriculture, even human biology. What if this was how cells operated at the microscopic level? What if this was the water of the future? But as excitement swelled, so did the skeptics. The experiments were incredibly sensitive. Results were inconsistent. And then came the moment of unraveling. Not in a physics lab, but in a bathroom. A researcher at the National Bureau of Standards ran an ultra-controlled test and discovered that the mysterious properties of polywater seemed to correspond closely to another chemical substance, human sweat. More tests confirmed it. The strange behavior of the new water was a byproduct of biological contamination, skin oils, microscopic debris, proteins. In other words, the miracle water had been polluted by the people testing it. Polywater wasn't a revolutionary state of matter. It was just regular water, mixed with trace amounts of grime. The fallout was swift and humiliating. Papers were retracted. Careers were sidetracked. The entire episode became a cautionary tale in scientific rigor. The phrase polywater turned into scientific shorthand for letting excitement outpace verification, for seeing what you wanted to see rather than what was there. But there was something poetic in its failure. Scientists, like the rest of us, are human. And sometimes, even water can play tricks on a thirsty mind. Speaking of frozen dreams and wishful science, the next hoax invited people to pay for a future that still hasn't arrived. One frozen body at a time. 26. The Cryionics Hoax. Early claims. Imagine this. You die, but it's not really the end. Instead, your body is flash frozen in a chamber of liquid nitrogen. Decades, or centuries, later, scientists discover the cure for what killed you. They revive your body, reboot your brain, and welcome you into the future like some time-traveling VIP. It's not science fiction. Well, it is. But not everyone treated it that way. In the 1960s and 70s, Cryionics entered the public imagination through a mix of science journalism, pulp fiction, and a few very confident salesmen. The basic pitch was simple. Don't die. Freeze. Wait. Come back better. The idea gained traction thanks in part to physicist Robert Ettinger's 1962 book The Prospect of Immortality, which laid out the theoretical case for cryogenic preservation. Ettinger wasn't a scammer. He genuinely believed in the possibility, but the field that grew from his ideas quickly split into two groups, the idealists and the opportunists. Early cryonics companies made huge promises. For the right price, they'd preserve your whole body, or just your brain if you were on a budget, and keep it indefinitely until medical science advanced enough to reverse death. Some even offered payment plans. What they didn't offer was evidence. There was no known way to repair cellular damage from freezing, no protocol for thawing a body without destroying tissue, no real success stories. Just hope, frozen solid. Then the lawsuits began. In several early cases, bodies were left to decompose after companies went bankrupt or failed to maintain equipment. Cryonic chambers failed. Facilities closed without notice. In one of the more infamous examples, 9 bodies stored in a California facility were found decomposing after the cooling system failed. The media had a field day. The frozen immortals were melting. It wasn't just a logistical problem, it was a branding disaster. Cryonics shifted from a visionary frontier to a punchline. Scientists pointed out repeatedly that freezing dead tissue without catastrophic cellular damage was not currently possible. Cryopreservation works for sperm, embryos, and certain small tissues, but not brains and not whole human bodies. Still, believers held on. New companies rose from the ashes. Some cleaned up the process, improved storage, and added layers of legal and financial protections. But the core claim, that you could die today and live again tomorrow or in 100 years, remains as speculative as it ever was. Today, hundreds of people are frozen in tanks in Arizona and Russia, suspended between faith and physics. Maybe one day they'll wake up, or maybe they're just well-preserved reminders that some dreams, when frozen, still decay. And if rewriting death wasn't ambitious enough, the next hoax tried something even more outrageous, claiming that the medieval period itself was one elaborate chronological lie. 27. The Phantom Time Hypothesis. Imagine waking up and learning that 297 years of history, including Charlemagne, the early Middle Ages, and nearly 3 entire centuries of Western chronology, simply never happened. That's the basic claim of the Phantom Time Hypothesis, a conspiracy theory so vast, so wildly confident, it feels like historical performance art. First proposed in the 1990s by German historian Herbert Illig, the theory argues that the years 614 to 911 AD were entirely fabricated. According to Illig, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII conspired to invent the figure of Charlemagne and artificially insert themselves into a grander historical narrative. The motive? Prestige. Legacy. And maybe the narcissistic thrill of living in the year 1000. The implications are staggering. If Illig was right, everything from medieval architecture to astronomical events to ancient manuscripts would have to be reinterpreted. Gregorian calendar reforms? Based on nothing. Islamic expansion? Misdated. Viking raids? Off by centuries. It was a theory built on the idea that entire chunks of history could be retroactively fabricated. And everyone just went along with it. Now, this wasn't an American hoax. But like most European pseudo-history, it found a curious audience in the United States. Alternative historians, conspiracy theorists, and chronology skeptics latched on. Self-published books and websites blossomed, drawing lines between supposed inconsistencies in historical records and proposing that archaeology, astronomy, and even radiocarbon dating were all part of a vast mistake, or cover-up. Supporters pointed to gaps in the archaeological record. They claimed medieval coins and documents were suspiciously scarce, that star charts didn't align with dated events, that histories written during those centuries were unusually reliant on legend. The academic community responded with a collective raised eyebrow and then moved on, because the theory collapses under basic scrutiny. Tree ring data, eclipse records, and carbon dating all align with the existing timeline. Islamic and Chinese historical records, entirely independent of European chronology, match the so-called phantom centuries. And Charlemagne, as it turns out, left behind a pretty hefty paper trail. Still, the phantom time hypothesis persists in fringe circles, because there's something seductive about the idea that history isn't just written by the victors, it's completely made up by them. That we're all living in a carefully curated fiction, and only a few brave revisionists can see through the illusion. And if invisible radiation and invisible centuries weren't enough, the next scientific myth involved an invisible energy, one that no one could detect, no one could explain, and yet for a time no one dared to say didn't exist. 28. N-rays. 1903. In 1903, French physicist Prosper René Blondelot made a groundbreaking announcement that no one could actually see. He had discovered a new form of radiation. He called them N-rays, after his home city of Nancy. According to Blondelot, these rays were invisible, but their presence could be detected because they caused slight increases in the brightness of objects, particularly when viewed through phosphorescent screens or prisms. To modern ears, this sounds suspiciously like someone claiming to have found the Emperor's new radiation. But at the time, the scientific world was still high on the fumes of real discoveries like X-rays and radioactivity. The late 19th and early 20th centuries had been a veritable buffet of invisible forces suddenly made real. Electromagnetism, ultraviolet light, electrons. So another invisible ray didn't seem all that implausible. Blondelot claimed N-rays could be emitted from various materials, especially metals and living tissue. His lab in Nancy became the epicenter of the research. Other scientists in France confirmed his findings. Dozens of papers were published. People saw what they expected to see: tiny flashes, momentary brightening, strange visual effects. It became, for a time, a fashionable field of study. But across the English Channel, skepticism was brewing. The American physicist Robert W. Wood, known for his keen eye and sharper wit, traveled to Blondelot's lab to see N-rays for himself. In a legendary moment of scientific sabotage, Wood secretly removed a critical prism from Blondelot's experimental apparatus mid-demonstration. Blondelot, unaware of the missing component, continued to describe the N-rays' effects that were now physically impossible. In short, he was seeing things that weren't there. Wood's report was damning. He concluded that N-rays were nothing more than a product of expectation and suggestion. The scientific community, especially outside France, quickly turned. N-rays were quietly buried, their papers shelved, and Blondelot's reputation suffered a slow academic collapse. The N-ray episode is still taught today as a cautionary tale of experimental bias. It's not that Blondelot was a fraud. He likely believed what he saw. But his belief, combined with a lack of rigorous controls, turned into a mass hallucination in lab coats. And while N-rays fizzled into oblivion, one even stranger story floated across the Atlantic, involving children with green skin, an alien origin theory, and the American sci-fi crowd's relentless desire to turn medieval folklore into extraterrestrial evidence. 29. The Green Children of Woolpit theory in American sci-fi circles. The story begins in 12th century England, in the village of Woolpit, where, according to legend, two children were found near a wolf trap, or wolf pit, speaking no known language, wearing strange clothes, and most intriguingly, having skin tinted green. The boy and girl were reportedly taken in by locals. The boy died soon after, but the girl lived on, gradually adapting to her new surroundings, learning English, and eventually explaining, or trying to, where she'd come from. Her version? She said they were from a place called St. Martin's Land, where everything was twilight, and the sun never shone. That's it. That's the entire account. A strange, medieval curiosity tucked away in chronicles written centuries ago. But then came the 20th century. And with it, America's deepening obsession with UFOs, interdimensional portals, and the possibility that aliens had been popping in for centuries. The story of the Green Children made its way into American pop culture via fringe publications, radio shows, and sci-fi conventions. Suddenly, the kids weren't from a neighboring village lost in the woods. They were extraterrestrial refugees, or time travelers, or survivors from an underground civilization. Writers in the 1960s and 70s repurposed the legend for everything from short stories to speculative nonfiction. Some theorized the children had accidentally passed through a dimensional rift. Others said they were alien-human hybrids whose green color was a result of chlorophyll in their skin, which, to be clear, is not how biology works, but it made for excellent book covers. The theories multiplied. Were they the result of a failed government experiment? Had they arrived through an ancient wormhole? Was Woolpit a medieval Roswell? None of this had any basis in fact. Historians have offered more mundane explanations: malnutrition, possibly from a diet high in beans and low in iron, can cause a condition called hypochromic anemia, which can make the skin appear pale and even slightly greenish. The children's strange language may have simply been a dialect unfamiliar to the villagers. And the tale itself? Likely exaggerated over centuries of retelling. Still, in the realm of American speculative fiction, the legend flourished. It tapped into something primal, the fear of the outsider, the wonder of the unexplained, the romantic notion that history is full of messages we've simply misread. And if green children weren't unsettling enough, the next figure on our list tried to rewrite biology itself, using enemas, cornflakes, and a crusade against pleasure. His name? Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, 30. Dr. Kellogg's healthy living claims. Before it was a breakfast cereal empire, the Kellogg name was associated with one of the strangest health crusades in American history. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, a medical doctor and Seventh-day Adventist, ran the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a spa-like health resort in Michigan that promised to purify the body and elevate the soul. The methods? A mix of pseudoscience, high-minded moralizing, and an almost comical obsession with the digestive tract. Kellogg was convinced that most of the body's ailments stemmed from poor digestion. To fix this, he developed a set of regimens that could generously be called rigorous. Daily enemas were encouraged, sometimes with yogurt. Meat was discouraged, then demonized. And sex? That was public enemy number one. Kellogg believed that sexual activity, especially, heaven forbid, self-gratification, was not only morally wrong but physically harmful. He recommended extreme diets and bland foods to suppress unhealthy urges. That's where the cornflakes come in. Originally designed as a deliberately boring, flavorless breakfast option, they were meant to calm passions, not excite the palate. Despite his extreme views, Kellogg became a towering figure in early American wellness culture. The Battle Creek Sanitarium attracted thousands of patients, including celebrities and politicians. His lectures were packed. His books sold in the millions. He promoted exercise, vegetarianism, fresh air, and auto-intoxication theory, the idea that decaying food in the colon produced toxins that poisoned the body. Much of it was nonsense. But sprinkled among the pseudoscience were real insights. Fiber is important. Exercise does matter. Fresh air and rest do help. Kellogg's fatal flaw was the leap from common sense to medical absolutism, and the belief that virtue and health were the same thing. Eventually, his more extreme practices fell out of favor, and Kellogg himself faded from the spotlight. His brother, Will Kellogg, took the cereal part of the business and ran with it, sweetening the flakes, marketing to kids, and building a brand empire that left the sanitarium behind. John Harvey Kellogg died in 1943, still convinced that enemas could save the world. His legacy is a bizarre mix of wellness revolution and repressive ideology, a reminder that even the pursuit of health can turn cultish when it trades science for sanctimony. And if breakfast wasn't strange enough, the next hoax involved moon men, telescopes, and the early American media's gleeful discovery that selling fiction was sometimes more profitable than telling the truth. 31. The Great Moon Hoax, 1835. In the summer of 1835, readers of the New York Sun were treated to a truly celestial revelation. The paper announced that the moon, yes, our moon, was teeming with life. Not just moss and microbes, but an entire thriving ecosystem, complete with bison, unicorns, bipedal beavers, and most famously, bat-winged humanoids who built temples and had philosophical debates beneath lunar waterfalls. The series, presented as a 6-part exposé, claimed to be the work of Dr. Andrew Grant, an assistant to the renowned British astronomer Sir John Herschel, who was said to be conducting observations from a powerful new telescope in South Africa. According to the articles, this telescope had such magnifying power that it could observe insects crawling on the moon's surface. People believed it. The articles were written with just enough technical jargon to sound plausible and just enough detail to override common sense. They included fake Latin names for species, elaborate descriptions of the moon's geography, and dramatic claims about alien civilizations living in harmony. Churches discussed the theological implications. Schools included it in lessons. Lectures were held. The public lapped it up. It was fiction, of course. The entire series was written by reporter Richard Adams Locke, who intended it as satire, a spoof meant to ridicule both pseudo-scientific sensationalism and the public's willingness to believe in wild, unverified claims. But the satire was missed. Instead, the hoax became a sensation, boosting the Sun's circulation dramatically. Other newspapers reprinted the articles without question. Locke, at first anonymous, became an unwitting media pioneer, a man who proved you could build an empire on elegant nonsense. Even when the truth emerged, many refused to accept it. Readers were so enchanted by the idea of lunar societies that they preferred the myth to the reality. Some papers accused the sun of lying. Others accused it of blasphemy, but sales kept climbing. The Great Moon Hoax remains one of the earliest and most successful examples of fake news in American history. It highlighted just how easily awe and imagination could be hijacked, how scientific authority could be faked, and how much the public craved a universe more magical than mundane. And speaking of media-induced panic, the next hoax didn't involve telescopes, just radio waves and a voice convincing people the Earth was under attack. 32. The War of the Worlds. Broadcast Panic, 1938. On the night of October 30th, 1938, millions of Americans tuned into their radios expecting music. What they got instead was an invasion. Martians descending from the sky, destroying New Jersey with heat rays, toppling the military, and laying waste to the American East Coast. Or so it seemed. What they were actually hearing was the Mercury Theater on the Air, Orson Welles' Halloween adaptation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds. The show was framed as a series of increasingly frantic news bulletins interrupting a musical program. The illusion was near perfect. Field reports, government statements, on-the-ground witnesses, the kind of realism radio had never really delivered before. And people bought it. At least, that's the legend. The story goes that Americans fled their homes in terror, that highways were jammed with panicked drivers, that churches filled with praying families, that people took to the streets believing the end was nigh. Newspapers the next day described it as a mass hysteria, the most successful media hoax of all time. But here's where it gets complicated. The panic may have been exaggerated. While some listeners were undoubtedly alarmed, the idea of nationwide chaos was largely pushed by newspapers. The same newspapers who, at the time, saw radio as a direct competitor for advertising dollars. The more they discredited radio, the better. They had motive, and they had headlines to sell. Later studies found that the actual number of listeners who thought it was real was probably quite small. Most tuned in late or only caught snippets. Some were confused, but few were running through the streets. Still, the myth stuck. Why? Because it revealed something uncomfortable. That even in an age before social media, disinformation could spread faster than truth. That authority could be mimicked. That panic could be manufactured with nothing more than sound effects and conviction. Orson Welles, for his part, was shocked by the response. He claimed he had no intention of fooling anyone, but the broadcast made him famous overnight and helped launch his film career. Not bad for an accidental alien invasion. The lesson? Sometimes fear doesn't need facts. Just a good story. And if that story happens to involve a rare species, a conservation crisis, and an animal that doesn't actually exist, all the better. 33. The Pacific Northwest tree octopus, 1998. In the dense digital forests of 1998, a curious website began to make the rounds. It featured a conservation campaign for the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, a rare and endangered cephalopod native to the rainforests of Washington state. According to the site, this elusive creature could climb trees, change color for camouflage, and even had a cultural presence among indigenous peoples of the region. It was, on the surface, a classic environmental appeal. The octopus was threatened by logging, climate change, and urban sprawl. Photos showed the creature clinging to branches. There were fake citations, a donation link, and impassioned pleas to save the tree octopus. It was also, of course, completely made up. The website, created by educator and internet prankster Lyle Zapato, was a piece of deliberate satire. It was designed to highlight just how easily misinformation could spread online, especially when dressed up in the aesthetic of scientific authority. But the real punchline came later, when educators began using it to test media literacy among students. The results were not encouraging. Many middle and high school students believed the tree octopus was real, not just momentarily fooled, completely convinced. Even when presented with obvious inconsistencies and told to evaluate the credibility of the site, a surprising number of students failed to identify the hoax. This launched a wave of hand-wringing over digital literacy in the internet age. Educators realized that simply growing up online didn't make kids good at vetting sources. They could navigate a browser, sure, but distinguishing fact from satire? Not so much. The tree octopus became a minor celebrity. It was referenced in academic papers, textbooks, and teacher workshops. It was cited, jokingly and sometimes not, in conversations about how the internet had eroded our collective sense of what's real. But the genius of the hoax was its tone, earnest, sincere, and only barely absurd. It mirrored the language and layout of genuine environmental campaigns so closely that it passed as truth, proving that a lie doesn't have to be convincing. It just has to look familiar. And if a fake octopus could climb its way into public consciousness, the next hoax took things underground, literally, with fossils that were faked not for profit but for revenge. 34. The Lying Stones of New York. In the mid-19th century, the scientific establishment was locked in a tense philosophical battle. Darwinists were gaining traction, but their critics, religious literalists and anti-evolution thinkers, weren't going down without a spectacle. Into this climate of ideological tug-of-war stepped a curious man named Jacob W. Deacon Knapp, an amateur stonecutter with a chisel, a sense of humor, and a quiet contempt for evolutionary science. Knapp began creating what would later be dubbed the Lying Stones, a collection of obviously fake fossils that he discreetly discovered in the upstate New York region. The stones bore images of bizarre creatures, unknown scripts, and exaggerated anatomical features. Some depicted animals that seemed half-human, others looked like fish with wings, and a few featured crude inscriptions in an unknown language. A prehistoric Rosetta Stone, if you squinted hard enough. The idea was not to make money, but to make a point. And that point was mockery. Knapp, like other hoaxers of his time, was pushing back against what he saw as academic arrogance. He viewed the rising prestige of evolutionary science as both godless and elitist, and he wanted to prove that scientists could be just as gullible as the rest of the public. He was right. Some scientists took the bait, at least initially. Fossil collectors and amateur archaeologists flocked to see the finds. A few believed the stones represented an undiscovered prehistoric script. Others argued they were proof of a lost race, predating even Native Americans, a dangerous and racist narrative that persisted in certain circles for decades. But the inconsistencies quickly piled up. The fossils lacked any biological structure, the engravings were shallow and unweathered, and the script, if it was one, resembled nothing seen in any known culture. Worse, some of the carvings looked suspiciously fresh, as if they'd been made in a garage and left in the backyard for a week. Eventually, the hoax was exposed. Knapp's motives were revealed, and his fake fossils were quietly moved to the footnotes of scientific journals. But the episode left a mark. It underscored how eager people were to believe in anything that could validate their worldview, whether scientific or religious. And as the century turned, belief in sinister forces began to move indoors, specifically into America's daycare centers. The next hoax wasn't carved in stone. It was whispered in courtrooms, screamed on daytime TV, and etched into the national psyche by a panic that never fully went away. 35. The Satanic Panic, Daycare Cases, 1980s-90s. It began with a single allegation. A worried parent, a strange statement from a child, a creeping suspicion that something evil was hiding in plain sight. Then the floodgates opened. Throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the United States was gripped by a moral panic that would come to be known as the Satanic Panic. The focal point, daycare centers. Allegations spread that childcare workers across the country were engaging in ritualistic abuse, invoking satanic cults, and hiding vast underground networks of evil behind playgrounds and story time. At the center of it all was the McMartin preschool case in California. What started as a single accusation ballooned into a nationwide hysteria. Investigators, often lacking training in child psychology, used leading and coercive questioning techniques. Children were asked, again and again, about tunnels, robes, candles, and dark ceremonies. Faced with adult pressure and the desire to please authority figures, some children began to remember elaborate, nightmarish scenarios. Stories spiraled into surreal territory. Secret dungeons, animal sacrifices, flying teachers, hot air balloon escapes. None of it was true. No physical evidence was ever found. No tunnels, no costumes, no photos. Yet the trials dragged on. In the McMartin case alone, the proceedings lasted 7 years, cost $15 million, and ended in 0 convictions. Other daycare providers across the country faced similar accusations. The Kelly Michaels case in New Jersey, the Fells Acres daycare case in Massachusetts, and many more. Innocent people were imprisoned, reputations destroyed, and entire communities turned upside down. The media, particularly daytime talk shows and sensational news outlets, fanned the flames. Experts in satanic ritual abuse made regular TV appearances, despite having no clinical credibility. Books and documentaries claimed a vast conspiracy was being ignored or covered up. Even law enforcement agencies created specialized units to investigate cult activity. Eventually, psychologists, journalists, and legal scholars began to push back. Studies showed how easily false memories could be implanted in children. Investigative reports exposed the flimsy evidence, the social pressure, and the courtroom theatrics. By the late 90s, most of the accused had been exonerated, but the scars remained. The Satanic Panic was not just a hoax. It was a feedback loop of fear, a self-replicating moral virus. It didn't need proof, it needed only belief. And that need to find hidden messages, to crack codes where none exist, would manifest again just a few years later in a very different cultural arena. This time not in the courts but in the record stores. 36. Paul is Dead, 1969. In 1969, at the height of Beatlemania's long, weird aftershock, a rumor began circulating that Paul McCartney, the charming, doe-eyed bassist of the Fab Four, had died in a car crash in 1966 and had been replaced by a look-alike. The theory? That the Beatles, grief-stricken and creatively rebellious, had left a trail of cryptic clues in their lyrics, album covers, and recordings to tell the truth without technically saying it. It was the perfect urban legend, just plausible enough, just weird enough, and completely irresistible to people with too much time and a decent record player. The so-called evidence came from obsessive fans who claimed the band had buried messages across their discography. On the cover of Abbey Road, the Beatles walk across a zebra crossing in what was interpreted as a funeral procession. John in white as the preacher, Ringo in black as the undertaker, George in denim as the gravedigger, and Paul barefoot and out of step, holding a cigarette in his right hand. Paul was left-handed. Conclusive? Of course not. Compelling? To some, absolutely. Then there were the audio clues. If you played Revolution 9 backward, it supposedly revealed the phrase, "Turn me on, dead man." In Strawberry Fields Forever, some claimed to hear John Lennon mumble, "I buried Paul." He later clarified he'd said, cranberry sauce, which didn't help. College radio stations picked up the story. Newspapers joined in. The Paul is dead theory became a pop culture phenomenon almost overnight. People began analyzing Beatles songs like religious scripture. Everything became symbolic. Every lyric, every chord change was another breadcrumb on the trail to the truth. But there was no truth. Paul was very much alive and very confused. He eventually addressed the rumor in interviews, amused but bewildered. The band played along for a while, partly for fun, partly to sell more records. The hysteria eventually died down, but the theory never entirely vanished. Even now, it occasionally resurfaces in internet forums and YouTube rabbit holes. Why did people believe it? Because the 1960s were a time of massive cultural upheaval. Trust in institutions was crumbling. Assassinations had become national rituals. Conspiracy was in the air. The idea that even the Beatles, the most beloved band in the world, might be complicit in some grand secret resonated with the collective mood. And in the decades that followed, conspiracy wouldn't just linger in the air, it would go digital and start pointing fingers at 5G towers. 37. The 5G Coronavirus Hoax. 2020. In early 2020, as COVID-19 spread across the globe and toilet paper disappeared from shelves with apocalyptic urgency, an even stranger contagion was gaining momentum. The idea that the pandemic wasn't caused by a virus, but by wireless technology, specifically 5G. According to this theory, the rollout of fifth-generation mobile networks was somehow either weakening immune systems or directly causing COVID-19 symptoms. Some said the virus didn't exist at all, that it was a cover story for radiation poisoning. Others claimed 5G activated a pre-existing virus, like some kind of electromagnetic sleeper agent. Still others went full sci-fi and said 5G was part of a global mind control operation. What began as fringe internet whispers soon found louder megaphones. Celebrities, social media influencers, and conspiracy influencers, yes, that's a job now, began repeating the claims. Videos with slick production values offered dramatic charts and vague scientific terminology. Terms like vibrational frequencies and electromagnetic fields were thrown around with the authority of a TED Talk and the accuracy of a fortune cookie, and people believed it. In the U.S., hashtags like #5G coronavirus trended. Protests were held. Cell tower workers were harassed. In other countries, things escalated further. Towers were set on fire. Technicians were threatened. Governments had to issue statements denying the link, not because there was any evidence to refute, but because the hoax had gone viral. To be clear, there is zero scientific evidence that 5G harms human health, much less causes or spreads viruses. 5G operates in a higher frequency range than previous wireless technologies, but still well below ionizing radiation, like X-rays or ultraviolet light. It cannot damage DNA. It cannot weaken your immune system. It cannot carry a virus. Viruses are biological. Radio waves are electromagnetic. The two do not mix, not even on conspiracy forums. So how did this happen? It wasn't just scientific illiteracy, though that certainly played a role. It was a perfect storm. A terrifying pandemic, widespread distrust of government and tech companies, and the constant hum of internet-fueled paranoia. 5G was already a subject of suspicion, with some groups claiming it caused cancer, insomnia, or energy sensitivity. COVID-19 simply gave the theory new urgency. The hoax revealed something deeper: the human brain's aversion to randomness. A virus is invisible, uncontrollable, and complicated. But a tower? A tower is something you can point to, blame, burn. It's something tangible in a world that suddenly felt anything but. And if paranoia could be projected onto technology, it could just as easily be turned inward, like the strange case of a disease where people believed their own skin was lying to them. 38. Morgellons disease. 2000s. In the early 2000s, a small but growing number of people began reporting a baffling condition: fibers, threads, or filaments emerging from their skin. They described itching, crawling sensations, and mysterious lesions that never fully healed. Some claimed they'd pulled blue or red strands from their wounds. Others reported what felt like parasites wriggling beneath the surface. Doctors gave them a puzzled look. Most tests came back normal. No parasites, no infections, just pain, confusion, and disbelief. This became known as Morgellons disease, a name borrowed from a 17th century reference to children erupting with hair-like growths, though there was no actual connection. The modern version first gained visibility when a mother in Texas, Mary Leitao, created a website documenting her child's symptoms. Soon after, thousands of people across the U.S. and beyond began to say, "Me too." Message boards lit up, support groups formed. And like many modern conditions, Morgellons developed an entire ecosystem of explanations. Some believed it was caused by genetically modified organisms. Others blamed chemtrails. The most common theory was that the fibers were some kind of synthetic implant, evidence of a secret government experiment or alien technology gone rogue. The CDC, pressured by public outcry, launched an investigation in 2006. Their final report, published in 2012, concluded that there was no infectious agent. The fibers were cotton, consistent with clothing. The lesions were self-inflicted or exacerbated by excessive scratching. The symptoms, they concluded, were best understood as a form of delusional parasitosis, a psychological condition, not a physical one. But for sufferers, the verdict felt like dismissal. To be told your suffering isn't real is often more painful than the symptoms themselves. Morgellons became a kind of medical Rorschach test. Where skeptics saw psychosomatic illness, believers saw a vast, unacknowledged epidemic. The disease, or belief in it, hasn't gone away. Clinics still receive patients convinced they're infected with something no one else can detect. Websites continue to collect photographs of skin lesions and fibers. Even some alternative medicine providers offer treatments, often at a high cost, rarely with results. Morgellons occupies a strange place in medical history, somewhere between hoax, delusion, and the body's desperate attempt to signal distress. Whether it's a psychiatric disorder, an environmental sensitivity, or a misunderstood condition remains open to interpretation. But what's undeniable is the suffering, and the fact that modern medicine still struggles to treat people whose ailments don't show up on a lab report. And speaking of invisible evidence and very visible outrage, the next theory tried to delegitimize the presidency of the United States with one forged document, one fake narrative, and years of breathless repetition. 39. The Obama birther conspiracy. It started as a whisper in fringe internet forums. Then it became a full-blown roar, talk show fodder, social media flame war, and political grenade all wrapped into one. The claim? That Barack Obama, 44th President of the United States, was not born in the United States. That he was, in fact, born in Kenya, and therefore ineligible to be president. It was a simple story with explosive implications. And like most hoaxes, its power came not from facts, but from repetition. The theory first gained traction during the 2008 presidential campaign, with a few poorly sourced articles and videos claiming Obama's birth certificate was missing, falsified, or listed the wrong country. The claims often cited unnamed Kenyan officials, misinterpreted documents, or out-of-context quotes from Obama's own autobiography. Some insisted that because his father wasn't American, he somehow didn't qualify. Others swore they remembered seeing a Kenyan birth certificate. No one could produce it, of course, but that didn't stop them. As the years passed, the theory mutated. It wasn't just about a birth certificate. It was about religion, identity, otherness. Obama wasn't just un-American, he was a secret Muslim, a socialist, a Manchurian candidate. It became a catch-all theory for people who couldn't accept that the son of a Kenyan immigrant and a white woman from Kansas could rise to the highest office in the land. In 2011, after years of smears, Obama released his long-form birth certificate. It clearly showed he was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, on August 4, 1961. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Some birthers claimed the document was fake, a forgery generated by Adobe Photoshop. Others shifted goalposts. It wasn't about the certificate anymore. It was about his loyalties, his values, his hidden allegiances. One particularly loud proponent, a real estate mogul named Donald Trump, used the theory as a springboard into national politics. Years later, he'd walk it back. Sort of. The birther conspiracy wasn't just a hoax. It was a political weapon, a dog whistle, a cultural test. It revealed how easily doubts could be manufactured, how quickly people would believe the worst, and how hard it is to erase a lie once it's been spoken often enough. And just when the smoke started to clear, another theory rolled in. Darker, broader, and even harder to kill. One that claimed the bodies were piling up, and the Clintons were behind them. 40. The Clinton body count. Some urban legends grow quietly in the shadows. Others are assembled piece by piece, brick by brick, until they become sprawling conspiracy skyscrapers too tall to ignore or verify. The Clinton body count is one such structure, a hoax with no foundation, yet still towering in the minds of millions. The theory began circulating in the early 1990s during the Clinton presidency, and it claimed that Bill and Hillary Clinton were tied to a suspiciously large number of deaths. Friends, associates, bodyguards, journalists, political donors, and anyone else who might have known too much. Depending on the version, the number ranged from a few dozen to well over 100. The implication was clear. Cross the Clintons, and you'd end up dead. It wasn't one cohesive theory, but rather a bundle of loose accusations stitched together by innuendo and connected by sheer repetition. One of the earliest names on the so-called list was Vince Foster, a White House aide who died by suicide in 1993. Conspiracy theorists immediately cried foul, despite multiple investigations, including by Republicans, confirming the cause of death. Still, the narrative took root. Foster knew secrets. The Clintons silenced him. After that, the list grew. A plane crash here, a car accident there, a mysterious illness, a mugging gone wrong. Each new death was added to the tally, regardless of circumstances. The more mundane the explanation, the more suspicious it became. If the person had even the most tangential connection to the Clintons, they were suddenly part of the body count. The internet supercharged the rumor. Chain emails in the late 90s gave way to viral blog posts and YouTube documentaries in the 2000s. Some claimed the list was compiled by an independent researcher or a concerned former insider, but no verifiable source was ever offered. The hoax was crowdsourced paranoia, a public spreadsheet of innuendo, updated whenever someone with a vaguely Clinton-shaped shadow died. No credible evidence has ever linked the Clintons to any of these deaths. In fact, many of the people listed on the so-called body count had no meaningful connection to them at all. But that didn't matter. The theory wasn't about proving anything. It was about reinforcing a feeling, the belief that powerful people get away with anything, and that truth is whatever confirms your worst suspicions. The Clinton body count became a kind of gateway drug for deeper conspiracy thinking. Once you believed a former president was running a murder-for-hire empire, the leap to global cabals and secret symbols wasn't that far. And as newer figures rose to power, the theory mutated, applied to new names, new enemies, new timelines. Because sometimes hoaxes don't die. They just change suits. And speaking of dead things that just won't stay dead, the next great American myth arrived in the form of swirling stalks, flattened fields, and what looked like alien graffiti until two guys with wooden planks spoiled the fun. 41. Crop circles as alien messages. They appeared in fields overnight, massive intricate patterns carved into crops with astonishing precision. Spirals, mandalas, geometric grids stretching for hundreds of feet. The first modern crop circles began popping up in England in the 1970s, but by the 1980s and 90s, they had migrated to the United States. Suddenly, Cornfields in Kansas and wheat fields in Oregon became canvases for what many believed were messages from extraterrestrials. TV specials speculated breathlessly. Was it alien communication? Interdimensional portals? Signs of a coming apocalypse? Pundits stood in the middle of these massive designs, arms outstretched, declaring them too perfect to be made by humans. No footprints, they said. No tire tracks. The mystery was sacred. And sacred things are profitable. Books were written. Tours were sold. Documentaries aired on prime time. People meditated inside crop circles hoping to commune with the cosmos. The circles became a phenomenon, not just physical curiosities, but psychological ones. People reported dizziness, spiritual awakenings, and vibrational downloads. It was the perfect blend of mystery, nature, and just enough pseudoscience to ward off questions. Then came Doug and Dave. In 1991, Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley, two British pranksters, held a press conference in London where they demonstrated exactly how they made the crop circles. With rope, planks, and a garden roller. They had started as a joke in the late 70s after reading about flying saucers and wanted to see if they could trick the public. They succeeded far beyond their expectations. Their designs were copied, refined, and eventually taken over by more serious, or at least more sober, artists. The duo admitted to making dozens of formations, including many of the early ones hailed as alien masterpieces. But their confession didn't kill the myth. Believers simply doubled down. Sure, they said, some are fake. But what about the real ones? There was always room for doubt. Always another spiral. In the U.S., crop circles became folded into broader UFO and New Age lore. They weren't just alien signatures. They were signs of awakening, gateways to other dimensions, proof that something, anything, was out there. The phenomenon was especially appealing because it let people feel chosen. The Earth was being communicated with, and they were smart enough to notice. The hoax had become bigger than its hoaxers, and like all great myths, it refused to vanish. Even now, people claim crop circles show signs of radiation, magnetism, or unknown frequencies. And no matter how many planks and ropes are found in a van nearby, someone will always whisper, "Yes, but this one's different." And speaking of hoaxes involving the sky, the next mystery unfolded in full view of the national news, with a silver balloon, a frantic family, and a 6-year-old boy who was never actually in danger. 42. The Balloon Boy Incident, 2009. On October 15, 2009, cable news networks were interrupted by a truly surreal live event. A silver, saucer-shaped helium balloon was drifting across the Colorado sky, reportedly carrying a 6-year-old boy. The nation watched in horror as the balloon floated for over an hour, covering more than 50 miles, chased by helicopters and emergency crews. Anchors speculated in real time about the boy's condition. Had he fallen out? Was he clinging to the inside? The phrase balloon boy trended worldwide before anyone even knew if he was alive. The balloon eventually touched down in an open field. Empty. Panic turned to confusion. Where was the child? Rescue crews scoured the landscape, fearing the worst. And then, several hours later, came the twist. The boy, Falcon Heen, was found hiding in the attic above his family's garage. Alive, unharmed, and very much not in a balloon. During a CNN interview that evening, Falcon was asked why he hadn't come out when people were calling his name. He looked at his father, hesitated, and mumbled, "You guys said we did this for the show." The hosts froze. The parents froze. America exhaled in confusion. Within days, the truth unraveled. The entire event had been staged by the boy's parents, Richard and Mayumi Heen, amateur storm chasers and aspiring reality TV personalities. They had hoped to land a television deal and figured a dramatic stunt involving their child, a homemade balloon, and live TV might be their ticket to fame. Instead, it was their ticket to court. The Heens were charged with multiple offenses, including conspiracy and false reporting. Richard served 90 days in jail. Mayumi received probation. They later apologized, sort of, and were eventually pardoned by Colorado's governor in 2020. But the damage to their reputation and to their child's Google results was permanent. The Balloon Boy incident is remembered as one of the strangest media hoaxes of the 21st century. A stunt that exposed how quickly news networks could be baited, how eagerly the public would tune in, and how thin the line had become between tragedy and entertainment. It wasn't just about fooling the media. It was about tapping into our deepest anxieties, about children in danger, about surveillance in real time, about the blending of reality and performance. And if a fake flying saucer could command that much attention, imagine what a fake photo, blurry, aquatic, and utterly unforgettable, could do for a Scottish legend adopted by the American imagination. 43. The Loch Ness Monster Photo, circulated widely in the U.S. In 1934, a photograph appeared in a British newspaper that would become one of the most famous and most scrutinized images of the 20th century. The photo showed what looked like the long neck and small head of a sea creature rising from the surface of Scotland's Loch Ness. Taken by a respected London surgeon, Colonel Robert Wilson, it became known simply as the surgeon's photo. To an eager public, it was the final proof of what many had hoped, that something ancient and mysterious still lurked beneath the waters of Loch Ness. Not a log, not a wave, but a real, breathing monster. The photo was treated as gospel. It circulated quickly through newspapers, magazines, and radio reports. It wasn't long before the legend leaped across the Atlantic. In the United States, where myths have a way of growing louder, Nessie became a kind of honorary citizen. Children read about her in National Geographic. TV specials tracked her every ripple. Cryptozoologists, those dedicated to the study of creatures science won't officially recognize, cited the photo as cornerstone evidence. Nessie wasn't just a Scottish curiosity anymore. She was a pop culture icon. But there were cracks in the surface, even early on. The image was blurry, of course, the kind of ambiguity that conspiracy theories thrive on. The creature's scale was hard to determine. And oddly, Wilson himself never claimed to have taken it. His name was attached to protect the identity of a friend. Over the years, skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. The size of the ripples didn't match a large creature, and the object seemed oddly toy-like. Then, decades later, the truth finally surfaced, literally and figuratively. In 1994, a deathbed confession by one of the conspirators revealed the photo was a hoax. The monster was a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted head and staged in the shallow waters of the loch. The hoaxers, a team including a disgruntled big-game hunter, a sculptor, and a prank-loving stepson, had orchestrated the photo in revenge against a newspaper that mocked an earlier Nessie sighting. The revelation should have ended it. But of course it didn't. The idea of Nessie proved stronger than any photographic retraction. For believers, the hoax only cast doubt on that photo, not on the legend itself. Others argued there were real sightings, and that the hoax had been created to discredit them. The photo, though fake, had built a world people didn't want to leave. And if Nessie could swim in American waters of belief, she wouldn't be alone. Another myth soon emerged, this time claiming Hitler hadn't died in a bunker at all, but slipped away and started over in South America. 34. The Hitler survival myth. In the final days of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were said to have taken their own lives in the Führer bunker. Their bodies burned in the courtyard above. The war ended. The Third Reich fell. History moved on. Or tried to. But within a few short years, rumors began to circulate that Hitler hadn't died at all, that he'd faked his death and escaped, like a comic book villain slipping out the back door as the building exploded. The idea grew rapidly. He hadn't died in Berlin, the theory claimed. He'd gone to Argentina. The Hitler survival myth was born, fueled by declassified FBI documents that noted reports of possible sightings. The theory claimed that a secret Nazi escape network, often referred to as Odessa, helped smuggle Hitler out of Germany and into the safe arms of sympathetic fascists in South America. There, according to some tellings, he lived for years, even decades, under various aliases. Some accounts said he grew a beard. Others claimed he had plastic surgery. A few went full pulp fiction, saying he raised a family and died peacefully in the 1970s. In the United States, the myth found a particularly receptive audience. Books with titles like Hitler Lives and Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler filled bookstore shelves. TV documentaries offered grave narration over grainy black and white footage. Conspiracy theorists mapped out secret submarine routes and analyzed blurry photos of old men in cafes. The appeal was obvious. If Hitler had escaped justice, then the war wasn't truly over. If history had lied about this, what else had it lied about? For some, the myth was about refusing closure. For others, it was about feeding suspicion and undermining trust in official narratives. But credible historians have roundly rejected the idea. Soviet troops recovered dental remains that matched Hitler's dental records. Eyewitnesses in the bunker testified to the suicide. Declassified intelligence reports were not evidence of escape. They were rumors followed up and dismissed. Even the CIA found no proof. Still, the myth persisted. Why? Because it provided a kind of twisted comfort. If evil wasn't truly vanquished, then the world's lingering cruelty made more sense. If monsters were still out there, it meant we hadn't failed. We'd just missed our target. And in the late 1990s, another alleged truth surfaced. This time not from a jungle bunker, but from a grainy VHS tape purporting to show what the government didn't want you to see: the autopsy of an alien. 45. The Alien Autopsy Tape, 1990s. In 1995, a British entrepreneur named Ray Santilli released what he claimed was the most explosive piece of footage in UFO history. A black-and-white film allegedly showing the autopsy of an extraterrestrial being recovered from the infamous Roswell crash in 1947. The tape was shaky, eerie, and weirdly mesmerizing. A bloated humanoid creature lay on a surgical table as figures in protective suits dissected its body with grim precision. There was no dialogue, only the soft whir of outdated film and the hum of conspiracy-fueled imagination. It was grotesque and oddly sterile, and it captivated audiences around the world. The film premiered on Fox in a special titled Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction, hosted by none other than Star Trek's Jonathan Frakes. It drew huge ratings. People were glued to their screens. Was this real? A government leak? Proof that Roswell wasn't just weather balloons and military denial? For a brief cultural moment, the tape became Exhibit A in the case for alien disclosure. UFO enthusiasts had long claimed that the U.S. government had recovered alien bodies from a crash in New Mexico. Now, here was the footage. Except, it wasn't. Skeptics raised red flags almost immediately. The film had no provenance. The techniques used didn't match real autopsy procedures. Anatomists noted inconsistencies in the alien anatomy. Then, in 2006, Santilli himself admitted that the footage was a reconstruction of a real film he claimed to have seen, which, conveniently, had deteriorated beyond recovery. He insisted that some frames were authentic, but no evidence was provided. So, was it a hoax? Almost certainly, but a profitable one. The tape played into a broader hunger in the 90s for hidden truths and secret knowledge. Shows like The X-Files had primed audiences to believe. Trust in government was low. Pop culture was saturated with the idea that something big was being covered up, and this tape felt like a breadcrumb. The alien, with its rubbery stillness and featureless face, became an icon. It showed up in parodies, Halloween costumes, and even a 2006 comedy film titled Alien Autopsy. The original footage may have been fake, but the cultural impact was real. Because when people want to believe in something, whether it's monsters in lochs or aliens in morgues, even the blurriest, fakest footage can become scripture. And the next hoax would take a darker turn, where white men donned feathers, rewrote spiritual history, and sold native identity like a stage act. 46. Fake Indian chiefs on the lecture circuit. 1900s. In the early 20th century, as the American frontier became more myth than memory, the appetite for native wisdom skyrocketed, especially among white audiences. People were desperate to believe that somewhere, the old world still whispered its secrets through ancient chants and feathered sages. Into that demand stepped a curious genre of performance art, the fake Indian chief. They arrived in lecture halls, churches, and traveling shows across the U.S., dressed in war bonnets and fringed leathers, often with suspiciously perfect English and suspiciously European last names. They billed themselves as Chief White Eagle, Red Hawk of the Plains, or the ever-popular Standing Bear, not to be confused with the real Ponca chief of that name. Some claimed to be the last of their tribe. Others swore they'd been gifted sacred knowledge that they alone could now share with the civilized world. For a fee, of course. The phenomenon blended vaudeville, spiritualism, and good old-fashioned grift. These men, almost always white, crafted elaborate backstories involving lost rituals, ancient prophecies, and secret meetings with elders deep in the mountains. They sold booklets on native wisdom, led faux purification ceremonies, and even claimed to have access to forgotten languages. Many were veterans of the Wild West show circuit, where playing Indian had already become a performance niche. Now, with Buffalo Bill gone and the stage dimming, they pivoted to education and authenticity. Audiences, especially white audiences, ate it up. These performers offered a guilt-free version of native identity, noble, mysterious, vanishing. It was nostalgia dressed in feathers, a way to mourn what America had destroyed while pretending to honor it. Real native people, of course, were not amused. By this time, they were fighting for land rights, religious freedom, and the survival of their languages. But the public wasn't interested in real politics. They wanted visions and parables. They wanted the Indian of their storybooks, wise, doomed, and silent unless booked for a keynote. One of the most infamous cases was Archie Finney, a Nez Perce anthropologist who warned that the trend was cultural ventriloquism. But even his words were drowned out by the stage acts. The irony was thick. America had spent centuries trying to erase indigenous voices. And now, it was paying white men to impersonate them. And while the fake chiefs spoke of mystical lakes and ancient beasts, another lake across the country had its own monster. One modeled on Nessie, fueled by folklore, and occasionally staged with more than just imagination. 47. The Loch Ness Monster in America. Champ in Lake Champlain. If Scotland had Nessie, then the United States had Champ. Lake Champlain, a 125-mile-long body of water stretching across New York, Vermont, and into Quebec, had long been home to whispers of a mysterious creature swimming in its depths. Sightings date back to the 1600s, with both Native American oral traditions and colonial-era writings describing a serpentine lake creature. But it wasn't until the 20th century that Champ truly became a household name. In the 1970s, the legend roared back into public consciousness thanks to a photograph. Sandra Mancy, a tourist visiting the lake with her family, snapped what she believed was a picture of the creature rising from the water. The photo showed a dark shape, long neck, small head, partially submerged body. Sound familiar? The image made headlines. Cryptozoologists hailed it as America's Nessie. News outlets ran with the story. T-shirts were printed. Lake Champlain suddenly had a monster-based tourism economy. Local businesses leaned into the legend with Champ-themed cruises, museums, and even commemorative soda cans. But the photo, like so many before it, raised eyebrows. The original negative was lost. The size and distance were impossible to verify. Experts suggested the creature was likely a submerged tree branch or a trick of the light. But by that point, the image had already done its job. It had fed the story. Champ sightings multiplied. People reported seeing humps in the water, strange waves, unexplained splashes. Many were likely misidentified sturgeon, logs, or boat wakes. A few were outright hoaxes, complete with rubber models and rigged photos. But the lore grew legs, or flippers, aided by a desire to believe in something ancient, elusive, and close to home. Why do these myths stick? Because they live in the quiet spaces. Foggy mornings, still waters, the brief moment before your brain catches up to your eyes. Lake monsters don't need to exist. They just need to not exist. As long as there's no proof they're fake, they stay real enough. Champ is now protected by law in both New York and Vermont, making it possibly the only mythical creature with a legal conservation status. You can't hunt Champ, harm Champ, or profit from harming Champ. And so, like Nessie, Champ endures. Half joke, half sacred cow, all folklore. But while Champ was allegedly lurking in cool lake waters, another supposed monster was being stored in a Georgia freezer, and it looked suspiciously like roadkill in a Halloween costume. 48. The Bigfoot Body in a Freezer, 2008. For decades, Bigfoot has been the poster child of North American cryptids, a walking contradiction of blurry sightings and booming merchandise. But in 2008, two Georgia men claimed they had done what no one else had, found the body. Matthew Whitten and Rick Dyer, a former police officer and a self-styled Bigfoot tracker, held a press conference and presented the evidence. A large, hairy, ape-like corpse stored in a chest freezer. They said they'd found it in the woods of northern Georgia. They released photos. They gave interviews. They even let a few cryptozoologists take a peek. The reaction was swift and chaotic. The Bigfoot community, a mix of true believers, armchair skeptics, and seasoned hoax hunters, erupted. Some were thrilled. Others were suspicious. But everyone was watching. National media picked up the story. TV stations dispatched crews. It was the closest thing to a Bigfoot State of the Union. Then came the thaw. When investigators, including Bigfoot enthusiasts who had shelled out money for access, finally examined the body in more detail, they found a rubber gorilla suit, stuffed with roadkill, possibly opossum. The face was latex. The feet were hollow. The hair was synthetic. It was a Halloween prop with a very generous marketing budget. The fallout was as predictable as it was embarrassing. Dyer and Whitten were called out for fraud. Their claims imploded. Whitten lost his job with the local police department. Dyer initially disappeared, only to resurface years later with another Bigfoot claim, equally dubious. Why fake a Bigfoot body? Because hoaxes work, especially when they play into pre-existing belief systems. Bigfoot believers were already primed to want this to be real. The media was ready for a splashy summer story. And the internet? The internet thrives on spectacle, even when it melts under scrutiny. What made this hoax particularly galling was its lack of effort. Unlike earlier Bigfoot fakes that used costumes in the woods or shaky cam trickery, this was just a cheap suit in a freezer. But it didn't need to be elaborate, just clickable. The freezer Bigfoot remains a low point in cryptid history, not just for its laziness, but for how easily it caught fire. It was the myth equivalent of fast food. Low effort, high calories, no substance. And yet, the public lapped it up. Until they didn't. Until it stank. Until they realized it wasn't an ancient hominid at all, just an ugly costume wrapped around a very old chicken dinner. But the next hoax went even darker. Not rubber and fur, but bone and reverence. An alleged alien mummy that traveled from New Mexico to headlines, and then finally, to the truth, which turned out to be far more human. 49. The Alien Mummy of Roswell, 2000s. It was supposed to be the smoking gun. The dusty, shrunken, undeniable proof that something non-human had crash-landed in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Forget the fuzzy photographs and second-hand testimonies. This time, believers had a body, or so they thought. In the early 2000s, a photograph began making the rounds in UFO circles and eventually landed on the radar of the mainstream press. The image, allegedly pulled from a slide recovered from an old collection belonging to a deceased geologist, showed what appeared to be a small, withered body lying on display behind glass. The head was elongated. The limbs were fragile, the skin leathery. There was no mistaking the suggestion. This was an alien, preserved like a biological secret waiting for its moment in the sun. Dubbed the Roswell slides, the photo came with just enough mystery to keep the narrative alive. The slides had been found in an attic. They had been analyzed by experts. Conferences were booked. Debates were staged. Prominent figures in the UFO community presented the image with all the theatrics of a Vatican revelation. The event that sealed it was a 2015 pay-per-view presentation in Mexico City, where the slide was shown to a live audience of over 6,000 people, with the backing of some of the most recognizable names in ufology. There was dramatic music, stage lighting, and rapturous applause. The body, they claimed, was the long-lost proof of Roswell's biggest secret, and we were finally seeing it. But within weeks, the illusion unraveled. Skeptics began analyzing the image with more care, particularly a small placard visible in the photograph. Using image enhancement techniques, they deciphered the text. The mummy was not an extraterrestrial. It was a preserved child's body, likely Native American, displayed at a museum in Mesa Verde, Colorado, a fact long documented and cataloged. The alien had been a mummified human, not the stuff of conspiracy but the tragic remnants of a lost history. And once again, the believers had mistaken sensationalism for substance. The fallout was swift and embarrassing. UFO experts who had staked their credibility on the slides issued apologies, denials, or vanished into strategic silence. The event became a cautionary tale, not just about gullibility, but about the ethics of exploiting human remains for entertainment. The real story, buried beneath layers of wishful thinking, was that of a child, a culture, and a careless world that had reduced both to sideshow fodder. But the hunger for revelation never really ends. It just shapeshifts. From the cosmos to the crypt, from the depths of the earth to the upper branches of trees. Which brings us to the start of the strange and entirely fictional case of the Pacific Northwest's most elusive arboreal cephalopod, the tree octopus. Wait, we already covered that one, didn't we? So now, with our list complete and all 49 hoaxes unpacked, we return to the central theme that binds them together. Belief. Not evidence, not reason, not even clever lies. Belief. Because in every one of these stories, from petrified giants to alien autopsies, the common thread is not just deception, but desire. The desire for a world with secret corridors, the need to feel chosen, the hunger for mystery, especially when reality feels too small. America in particular has always thrived on the hoax. It is a country built not just on ideas, but on stories about those ideas, some noble, some delusional, and some entirely fabricated. And in a landscape where fact competes with feeling, hoaxes don't just survive, they evolve. They find new forms, new followers, new platforms. What was once carved in stone becomes written in code. What was once whispered in lecture halls now trends on social media. The Cardiff Giant had to be dug out of the ground. Today's hoaxes arrive with a ping on your phone, but the anatomy remains the same. A kernel of truth, a twist of imagination, and an audience willing to believe. Which leaves only one question. If the next great American hoax dropped tomorrow, wrapped in science, dressed in sincerity, broadcast with high production values, would you recognize it? Or would you, too, share the link, pass it on, and become one more dot in the data trail of belief? Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. The greatest hoax of all might still be ahead.